It began with a subtle shift. I wouldn't have noticed if I wasn't paying attention, but a whisper of doubt started creeping into my mind. Emma, my wife of 6 years, had always been glued to her phone, managing work, keeping up with friends, and posting on social media. But lately, it was different. She smiled at her screen more than at me, her laughter more private, and her phone rarely left her side. It wasn't just the phone, though. She had become distant, her kisses mechanical and her hugs shorter. Our evenings, once filled with banter and shared dreams, now felt like silences I had to fill alone. She began spending more time, working late, or catching up with old friends, leaving me to wonder where she really was. The final nudge came when she asked for a weekend away to recharge. I trusted her. After all, marriage was built on trust, wasn't it? But something about the request sat uncomfortably in my gut. I didn't say anything at first. I wanted to believe it was all in my head. But doubt is a persistent beast, and it wasn't long before I found myself staring at her phone one evening while she showered. Locked. Of course. It hadn't been before. My chest tightened, but I told myself not to jump to conclusions. She returned from the weekend trip glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years, but when I asked about it, her answers were clipped and vague. Just a lot of rest, she said, her eyes avoiding mine. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided to investigate, not out of jealousy, but because I needed to understand. And so, I began piecing together fragments of her story, starting with an innocent glance at her browser history. That's when I found the forum. A thread titled, "When Online Friends Turn into Something More." The discovery was both chilling and validating. My wife, it seemed, had been chatting with someone, a man she'd met online. It was the start of a spiral I wasn't prepared for. I couldn't sleep that night. The thought of Emma confiding in some stranger, laughing with him, sharing pieces of herself I thought were mine, gnawed at me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. The next day, while she was at work, I took the risk of logging into our shared desktop. Her accounts were synced there, a remnant from the days when we trusted each other with everything. I felt a wave of guilt as I opened her email, but it quickly vanished when I saw his name. His name was Liam. Their email started casual, like old friends catching up, but as I read further, they became something else entirely. There were jokes, compliments, and inside references I couldn't understand. And then, there was a shift. One email stood out. "I can't stop thinking about you, Liam. It feels wrong, but at the same time, it doesn't. You make me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I don't know what to do about it, but I know I can't stop." My hands trembled. My chest felt hollow. It was one thing to suspect, but to see the words staring back at me, it was something else entirely. I scrolled further, needing to know how far it had gone. There were plans. Meetings. The weekend recharge trip had been with him. The emails didn't leave room for doubt. They'd spent those 2 days together. I closed the laptop and sat there, staring at nothing. The weight of it pressed down on me. This was my wife. The woman I had promised to love and protect. The person I thought would always choose me. And now, she was choosing someone else. That evening, I acted normal. I made dinner, smiled when she told me about her day, and even kissed her goodnight. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more. I needed her to admit it. The next morning, I installed a tracking app on her phone. I hated myself for it, but I needed the truth. If she was going to tear apart our marriage, I deserved to see the threads unraveling. I didn't have to wait long. That very night, she texted him, "I can't wait to see you again. Same place next week?" It was like being hit by a truck, but I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. If she wanted to betray me, I'd make sure she felt the weight of it. The next week crawled by, every day filled with the unbearable weight of knowing what she was doing behind my back. I kept watching, each text, each location update adding another crack to my resolve. Liam wasn't just some passing fling. He was someone she was making time for, planning around and prioritizing over me. I told myself I needed to stay calm, to be strategic. A blow-up confrontation would give her the upper hand. Let her twist the narrative into me being the unreasonable one. No, I needed to control the situation. On Friday morning, I kissed her goodbye as she left for work. She smiled at me like everything was fine, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. My stomach turned at her audacity. As soon as she was out the door, I followed the tracker on her phone. She wasn't going to the office. Her car took her to a coffee shop first, one we used to go to together. That hurt more than I expected. She didn't linger there long, just enough time to grab 2 drinks, one for her and one for him. I followed at a distance, careful not to get too close. Her next stop was a small hotel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place people go when they don't want to be seen. She parked, and I watched from down the street as she met him at the door. Liam was younger than me, athletic, with an air of arrogance that made me want to punch him on sight. He kissed her, casual, like they'd done it 100 times before, and they went inside. My chest tightened. This was it. Proof of everything I'd been dreading. I sat in my car, staring at the hotel, unsure what to do next. Confronting them there felt too impulsive. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. Instead, I waited. After 2 hours, they emerged, laughing and touching like teenagers sneaking around. My stomach churned as I snapped a few photos from the safety of my car. This wasn't just for me. It was for what came next. If she wanted to blow up our marriage, she was going to do it on my terms. When Emma got home that evening, she was glowing. It was the same glow she'd had after the recharge weekend, and it made my blood boil. But I kept my cool, pretending everything was fine. I didn't ask about her day. I didn't say much at all. At dinner, she noticed my silence. "You okay?" she asked, feigning concern. I looked up from my plate, meeting her gaze. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to eating. I watched her across the table, wondering how long she thought she could keep this charade up, how long she thought I would let it go on. That night, after she fell asleep, I packed my bag. It was time to put the next part of my plan into motion. I couldn't stay in the house, not with her sleeping peacefully next to me like nothing had happened. So, I left. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the night air cool my simmering anger. Eventually, I ended up at my brother's place. Eric opened the door, bleary-eyed and confused. "What are you doing here, man? It's the middle of the night." "I need a place to stay," I said, my voice tight. "Just for a while." He didn't ask questions. Eric never did. He stepped aside and let me in, and within minutes, I was set up on his couch. But sleep didn't come. My mind was racing with everything I'd seen, everything I'd heard. Every smile she gave him felt like a knife in my back. The next morning, I made the call. My lawyer, an old college friend named Adam, picked up on the second ring. "Ethan, what's going on?" he asked. "You don't sound good." "I need your help," I said. "It's about Emma. She's been cheating on me." Adam didn't waste time with sympathy. "Do you have proof?" "Yeah. Texts, photos, even tracking her to a hotel." "Good," he said. "I hate to say this, but you need to gather everything you can. If this goes to court, you'll want to show a pattern of behavior. Keep calm, keep documenting, and don't confront her until you're ready." I hung up, feeling a strange sense of purpose. This wasn't just about catching her in the act anymore. It was about protecting myself, making sure I wasn't the one left picking up the pieces while she moved on without consequence. Over the next few days, I worked quietly. I copied her phone data onto my computer, forwarded emails to my own account, and printed out the most damning texts. I even found receipts for dinners and gifts she'd bought for Liam, using our joint account. The hardest part was acting normal around her. Every smile, every touch, every time she called me babe, it felt like a slap in the face. But I played along, knowing that the endgame was worth it. One night, as she showered, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. I glanced at it and saw Liam's name. I couldn't resist. "I'm counting down the days. You're all I think about." It was sickening. I wanted to throw her phone against the wall, to scream at her for what she was doing to us. But I didn't. Instead, I took a screenshot and added it to my growing collection of evidence. The final piece came a week later. I followed her to another meeting with Liam, this time at a restaurant. They sat in a secluded booth, holding hands across the table. I recorded it all from my car, my hands trembling as I held the camera. When she got home that night, I was waiting for her. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down. "You're up late." I stood there, holding the photos in my hand. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered, and for the first time in months, I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "What about?" I held up the photos. "About this." The blood drained from her face as she stared at the evidence. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, she was the one left speechless. And it was only the beginning. Emma stood frozen, her eyes wide as she stared at the photos I held in my trembling hand. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for an excuse, a way to explain the inexplicable. But there was no hiding from it now. I had everything: photos, messages, proof of every betrayal. "Ethan, I can explain," she stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own lies. "Explain?" I asked, my tone cold and measured. "Explain how you've been sneaking around with Liam? How you lied to my face every day? How you took our life and decided it wasn't enough for you?" Tears welled in her eyes, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd loved, the one I'd married. But it wasn't enough to pierce through the fury that burned inside me. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was it supposed to be, Emma?" I snapped. "You were just going to keep me in the dark while you played house with him? Or were you planning to leave eventually? What was the plan?" She shook her head, tears now streaming down her face. "I don't know. I didn't plan it. It just happened." "That's not good enough," I said, my voice rising. "You don't just fall into someone else's bed by accident. You made a choice, Emma. Over and over again. You chose him. And now you're telling me you didn't think about what that would do to me." Her sobs grew louder, and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said through her tears. "But you did," I said, my voice quieter now. "You hurt me, Emma. You tore us apart." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the weight of her guilt pressing down on her, but it didn't bring me any comfort. She had broken something that couldn't be fixed, and no amount of tears or apologies would change that. Finally, she looked up at me, her face red and blotchy. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. "What can I do to fix this?" I stared at her, the woman who had been my everything and yet had destroyed us so completely. "You can start by telling me the truth. No more lies, no more excuses. Just the truth." She nodded, her voice trembling as she began to speak. "Liam, he was someone I met online, just a friend at first. We talked about work, life, things I felt like I couldn't talk to you about." I flinched at her words, but I let her continue. "It got out of hand," she admitted. "We started meeting in person, and I don't know. I thought he made me feel something I'd lost. But it was a mistake, Ethan. I know that now." "A mistake?" I said bitterly. "No, Emma. A mistake is forgetting our anniversary or burning dinner. What you did was a betrayal." Her shoulders shook with fresh sobs, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But it was quickly drowned out by the anger and pain that had been building for weeks. "I'm going to need some time," I said finally, standing and turning toward the door, "to figure out what's next." "Ethan, please," she called after me, her voice desperate. "Don't leave." I stopped but didn't turn around. "You left me first, Emma. You just didn't have the guts to tell me." With that, I walked out, leaving her to sit alone with the wreckage she'd caused. I drove aimlessly that night, the weight of Emma's confession bearing down on me like a lead blanket. Her words played over and over in my mind. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But how else could it have been? Betrayal doesn't come with neat edges or soft landings. Eventually, I ended up at a late-night diner, the kind with fluorescent lights and vinyl booths that felt oddly comforting in their familiarity. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and stared out the window, trying to piece together the fragments of my life. What was left of us? Was there anything worth saving? Could I even forgive her if I wanted to? I thought about her tears, the way her voice cracked as she tried to explain herself. A part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that she regretted what she'd done, that we could somehow rebuild what had been shattered. But another part of me, the part that had watched her walk into that hotel with him, knew better. She hadn't been thinking of me, of us. She'd been thinking of herself. By the time I returned to my brother Eric's place, the sun was beginning to rise. Eric was waiting for me in the living room, a mug of coffee in hand. "You want to talk about it?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I shook my head. "Not yet." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take your time. You know where I am." I spent the rest of the day in a fog, avoiding my phone and the inevitability of facing Emma again. I knew she would call, and when I finally checked, there were dozens of missed calls and messages, each one more desperate than the last. "Emma, Ethan, please come home. We need to talk." "Emma, I'm sorry. I don't know how to make this right, but I'll do whatever it takes." "Emma, I love you. Please don't give up on us." The words felt hollow. If she truly loved me, she wouldn't have done this in the first place. By the third day, I couldn't avoid her any longer. I agreed to meet at the house, needing to face the reality of what came next. When I walked in, she was waiting in the living room, her face pale and drawn. "You came back," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Only to talk," I replied, keeping my tone cold. She nodded, wringing her hands nervously. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being honest. And there's something I need to tell you." I stiffened, bracing myself for another blow. "It wasn't just the emails or the hotel," she admitted. "It went further than that. Liam wasn't the only one." Her words hit me like a freight train, stealing the air from my lungs. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "There were others," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It started after we had that big fight last year. I felt so alone, and I didn't know how to tell you. I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm so sorry." I stared at her, the woman I thought I'd known, now a stranger in every way that mattered. My fists clenched, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Is that it?" I asked. "Or is there more?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, I knew there was more. "There was one other thing," she said, her voice barely audible. "Liam, he met Max." My heart sank. Max, her favorite dog, the golden retriever she adored more than anything. She'd introduced him to our life, to our family, as if nothing was sacred. That was the breaking point. "You brought him into our home? Into Max's life?" I shouted, my anger finally boiling over. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything we built together." "I didn't mean to," she started, but I cut her off. "Stop," I said, my voice firm. "I don't want to hear your excuses anymore. You made your choices, Emma, and now I'm making mine." I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. But as I drove away, an idea began to form. A way to take back a piece of what she'd stolen from me. The betrayal had carved a hole in my chest that I didn't know how to fill. Emma's confessions, each worse than the last, played on an endless loop in my mind. But it was Max, our golden retriever, her pride and joy, that tipped the scales. Max had been with us since the early days of our marriage, a bundle of fur and boundless energy we both adored. He'd been there for every milestone, every fight, every quiet moment of solace. And now, knowing she dragged him into her deceit, using him as part of her double life, made my blood boil. If Emma thought she could tarnish even Max's innocence, she was wrong. I returned to Eric's place, where I laid everything out to him for the first time. He listened quietly, nodding in agreement when I told him I needed to do something. Something that would make her feel the weight of what she'd done. "What's the plan?" Eric finally asked, his voice steady. "I'm taking Max," I said simply. He raised an eyebrow. "You think that's enough?" "I mean, yeah, it'll hurt her, but will it really make her understand?" "It's not just about hurting her," I explained. "Max deserves better than to be used like some pawn in her twisted games. She's the one who broke us, and she doesn't get to keep pretending everything is fine. Taking Max will send a message. She's losing everything, even the things she loves most." Eric leaned back, considering. "All right, how do you want to do this?" I didn't have a detailed plan yet, but I knew the opportunity would present itself. Sure enough, it came sooner than expected. That Saturday, Emma texted me, asking if we could sit down and talk things through. She suggested a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown. It was perfect. I agreed to meet her, knowing she'd leave the house to make it happen. As soon as she confirmed the time, I swung by the hardware store and bought a few supplies, a new dog crate, some food, and a leash. Max and I were about to go on a little trip. At the appointed time, I parked a block away from our house, waiting until Emma's car pulled out of the driveway. I gave her a head start before heading inside with my spare key. Max greeted me with his usual enthusiasm, wagging his tail and licking my face as if nothing in the world had changed. It was bittersweet. "Hey, buddy," I said, ruffling his ears. "You ready for a new adventure?" He barked, his tail wagging furiously as I attached the leash and led him outside. I loaded him into the car, my heart heavy but resolute. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about giving us both a fresh start. I left a note on the counter, short and to the point. "Max is coming with me. You don't deserve him." By the time Emma returned home, Max and I were long gone. We drove out to a cabin I'd rented a few hours away, a place where I could think clearly and figure out my next move. Max settled into the new surroundings easily, his happiness a stark contrast to the turmoil inside me. That night, my phone buzzed incessantly. Dozens of calls and texts from Emma flooded in, each one angrier than the last. "Emma, where is Max? What are you doing?" "Emma, Ethan, this isn't fair. He's my dog too." "Emma, you can't just take him like this. Bring him back now." I didn't respond. Let her stew in it for a while. Let her feel the helplessness I'd been drowning in for weeks. As I watched Max snoozing by the fireplace, I felt the first flicker of peace I'd had in months. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. But it was a start. By the next morning, the messages from Emma had shifted from anger to desperation. My phone buzzed with notifications as I brewed coffee, each vibration like a small victory. She was feeling the sting now. "Emma, please, Ethan, don't do this. Max means everything to me. Emma, let's talk. We can work this out. I'll do whatever you want. Just bring him home. Emma, I miss you. I miss us. Don't take him away from me." I ignored them all. I wasn't ready to engage, not while her words still carried the weight of manipulation. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry for what she was losing. There was a difference. Max, oblivious to the chaos, bounded around the cabin, sniffing every corner like it was a new adventure. Seeing his unfiltered joy brought a small smile to my face, even as the knot in my chest tightened. I'd made the right decision taking him, but the next steps loomed over me like a storm cloud. By mid-afternoon, Emma's text stopped, replaced by a single, ominous message. "Emma, you're not answering me, so I've called a lawyer. I'll fight for him if I have to." The words sent a jolt through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. She had no idea what she was up against. I'd spent the past week compiling evidence of her infidelity, not just for the divorce, but to show she wasn't fit to keep Max. He'd always been her emotional anchor, her baby, and yet she dragged him into her web of lies. If she wanted a fight, I was ready. I reached out to my lawyer, Adam, filling him in on the latest developments. He was unfazed, his calm demeanor a much-needed anchor in my storm of emotions. "She can threaten all she wants," Adam said. "The court will prioritize Max's best interests. You've got a solid case with the evidence you've gathered. Just stick to the plan." And so, I did. The next day, I decided to break my silence. I wanted her to know I wasn't backing down, that I wasn't the same naive husband she'd betrayed. I called her, the line connecting after just one ring. "Ethan," she said, her voice a mix of relief and frustration. "Where's Max?" "He's safe," I replied coldly, "and he's staying with me." "You can't just take him," she snapped. "He's my dog too." "No, Emma," I said firmly. "He's not. Max doesn't deserve to be a pawn in your games. While you were out destroying our marriage, I was the one taking care of him, loving him. You don't get to claim him now." Her tone softened, a calculated shift. "Ethan, I made mistakes. I know that. But this isn't fair. Max is the only thing keeping me sane right now. Please, just bring him home." "Fair," I said, laughing bitterly. "You want to talk about fair? You lied to me, cheated on me, and dragged Max into your mess. Fair went out the window the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought she might be crying. But when she spoke again, her voice was cold and resolute. "If you think you're going to get away with this, you're wrong. I'll see you in court." "Then I guess I'll see you there," I said, hanging up before she could respond. That evening, I sat by the fire, Max curled up at my feet. The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that allowed my thoughts to settle. I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a flicker of satisfaction. Emma had shattered our marriage, but I wasn't going to let her take everything from me. This was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Adam and I worked tirelessly to solidify my case against Emma. My evidence of her infidelity, paired with receipts and messages showing her neglect of Max during her escapades, painted a clear picture. She wasn't the responsible caretaker she claimed to be. Adam assured me that family courts rarely litigated over pets, but in cases like ours, Max's welfare could tip the scales. "You've been his primary caregiver," Adam said, "and given Emma's actions, we can argue she's unfit to keep him." Emma, meanwhile, was relentless. Her lawyer sent letter after letter, demanding Max's return. Each was met with the same response: silence. I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. What she didn't know was that I had a trump card. A series of texts where she casually mentioned leaving Max alone for hours while meeting Liam. One message even joked about Max being jealous of her spending so much time with her special boy. It was damning evidence, and I couldn't wait to see her squirm in court. But even as I steeled myself for the battle ahead, doubts crept in. Was I doing the right thing? Was this about Max's well-being, or was it revenge? Those questions haunted me, but every time I looked at Max, wagging his tail without a care in the world, I knew I was doing the right thing. For both of us. Our first court appearance was surreal. Emma was there, dressed in a somber black dress, her makeup carefully done to emphasize her distress. Her lawyer painted her as a loving, devoted pet owner who was being unfairly targeted by a vindictive spouse. I stayed calm, letting Adam do the talking. He presented the evidence methodically: Emma's infidelity, her neglect of Max, her pattern of deception. The judge listened intently, occasionally glancing between us as the tension in the room thickened. Emma's lawyer tried to counter, arguing that Max had always been part of her life, that I was using him as leverage to punish her. But the evidence spoke for itself. When Adam presented the texts about Max being left alone, Emma's face turned pale. She avoided my gaze, her confident facade cracking. By the end of the hearing, the judge ordered temporary custody of Max to remain with me until a final decision could be made. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step in the right direction. A week later, I received an email from Emma. It wasn't the vitriolic rant I'd expected. It was something else entirely. Subject: I need to tell you the truth. Ethan, I know you hate me, and you have every reason to. But there's something I need to say, something I should have told you a long time ago. Liam wasn't just someone I met online. He was someone I knew before I met you. We had a history, and when things got hard between us, I turned to him because it was easy, because it felt familiar. The rest of the email was an apology, a plea for understanding, but I couldn't get past the revelation. Liam wasn't just some fling. He was a ghost from her past, one she'd let haunt our marriage. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible, but it also clarified things. She hadn't just betrayed me. She'd never truly let go of him. Our marriage had been built on a lie. The second court hearing was more contentious. Emma, emboldened by her lawyer's theatrics, painted a picture of herself as the victim of an overzealous husband. But Adam countered brilliantly, reminding the court of her neglect and using her own messages against her. By the end of it, the judge ruled in my favor. Max would remain with me, permanently. The relief was immense, but it was bittersweet. I had won, but the battle had taken a toll on my heart, leaving scars I wasn't sure would ever heal. When we left the courthouse, Emma approached me. "You've taken everything from me," she said, her voice trembling. "No, Emma," I replied. "You did that to yourself." With the court case behind me, I began piecing my life back together. Max and I returned to the cabin, where the quiet gave me space to think, to heal. I started therapy, something I'd resisted for far too long, and slowly began to understand the depths of Emma's betrayal and my own capacity to rebuild. Eric visited often, bringing beer and bad jokes to lighten the mood. "You know," he said one evening, "you're better off without her." I nodded, knowing he was right. Emma had been my world, but she'd also been my undoing. Now, it was time to find myself again. Months later, while hiking with Max, I met someone. Her name was Claire, and she had a dog of her own, a spirited border collie named Luna. We struck up a conversation, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed without reservation. Claire was kind, funny, and unassuming, everything Emma hadn't been. We started meeting regularly, our dogs becoming fast friends. It wasn't love at first sight, but it was something better. Hoped as the years passed, the pain of Emma's betrayal faded. Max remained my loyal companion, a constant reminder of resilience and unconditional love. Claire and I grew closer, eventually building a life together filled with laughter, trust, and a sense of peace I hadn't known before. Looking back, I realized Emma's betrayal had broken me, but it had also set me free. Free to rediscover myself, free to find happiness, and free to start over. And as I watched Max chasing Luna through the fields one crisp autumn morning, I knew one thing for certain. We had both found our way home,